And so the three things that I really want to achieve in my brief time with you, one is to really put on a lot of what others have said, but one is to just really give you an inkling of why an organization that has a panda logo, WWF, cares about these issues and would be even at a conference like this in case you don't know us or what our interests are in animal nutrition. The second one is really about leveraging and connecting the dots and having you think a little bit broader about what sustainability means beyond climate, beyond carbon. And there was some of that discussion in the last panel. And I'm sorry I wasn't here in the morning. And then the third one is to really open an invitation of considering an organization like ours. You guys are the hardcore technical researchers. That is not, actually I do have a DVM and a PhD animal nutrition on my team, but thinking of the connections of an organization like ours to leverage and advance some of your agendas where you cannot, right? How do you leverage and think of partnering with an organization like ours, especially on feed? So I really am focusing down on feed. I think the original title of my talk was around, do we need animals in the future of food? And I think that was what we originally asked me to talk about, and the answer would be yes. And so that would sort of, I would sit down and that would be my talk. And instead, I think I really wanted to focus on the feed piece, which underpins livestock commodities, including aquaculture, not just terrestrial livestock writ large. And again, try to have a little bit of an expansive notion on a few key concepts that are really important for us. So that is how there's been a little pivot from what is in your brochure and what was advertised versus what I'm going to cover today. And then I'll be at the reception. So if people want to talk more about the broader questions, happy to as well. So again, thank you, and we can launch in. So next slide. So I'm going to breeze through these a little bit about us really quick. So WWF, if you didn't know, we evolved from an organization that cared about wildlife to really caring about the places and ecosystems that support that wildlife, but not just the wildlife and nature, but the people that live there and the rest of the world that depends on nature. So we really are an organization that focuses on nature and biodiversity, and we've evolved over time. And we are a global organization with our founding actually in Switzerland with global leaders. Next. Just really quickly, again, our high-level goal and mission is really about to stop the degradation of the planet's natural environment. And then again, it's a conservation and development agenda married together. So absolutely, we need food, we need energy, but within planetary boundaries and aligned with our nature goals. I'm not going to go through all of our three core top line objectives, but I'll just note it is about species, places, and our footprint, and that people really are at the center. We're not wildlife for wildlife's sake. Next slide. We have 6 primary areas that we focus on, our thematic topics. I lead in WWF US. I'm Melissa Ho. I think I probably should have said that at the top. And I sit in WWF US. We, as I mentioned, have 100 offices around the world and a global headquarters in Switzerland. I lead 2 of these 6 goal teams, freshwater and food. And the thing I want to note is that they're separate goal teams, but the idea is integration and really about leverage and the impacts across goal teams. We're really trying to break down silos. So there's such a connection, as I'm sure you all know, between freshwater and food. It's between all of them, really. Next slide. And then just the way our strategy and how we approach the world and thinking in these 6 goal teams and that we care about nature and wildlife. We have place-based strategies, so conservation landscapes that are a priority because they hold such rich biodiversity and there's such an interface with people and development pressure. But we also look at drivers and whole planet solutions. So things like excessive demand for agriculture, driving conversion, et cetera. So we know we need these things, but we also want to look at how do we protect, conserve, and manage our critical places. Next slide. So, and can you just click to get the full, yeah. So I just wanted to also mention, we are a science-based organization and partner with scientists around the world. This is our flagship report and tells a lot about the DNA and sort of existential priorities of WWF. And that is our Living Planet report, which comes out every 2 years. We've been doing it for the last couple decades, and it's based on data from 1970. And again, we partner with scientists from around the world to really track global populations of biodiversity of many thousands of species around the world. And so the punchline is pretty grim that since 1970, we've seen a steady pretty dramatic decline in populations around the world. And I could totally take this apart by sharks, by, lizards, by, in Brazil versus China versus, we've got that data, but this is just the top line. And so this is why we elevate as an organization nature as a crisis and as a concern for the planet, equal, and if not even more so than the climate crisis, the 1.5 degree goal. And so if you were attuned to the Global Biodiversity Framework Convention in Montreal last year, the Kunming-Montreal Protocol or Agreement Framework, that was the UNFCCC equivalent for climate. The Kunming-Montreal Protocol, or sorry, I keep saying protocol, framework, was the Global Biodiversity Framework that is setting the world's targets and goals and commitments to help conserve nature. So they're not separate. They should go together. These are both conventions as part of the Rio Convention, but we often don't remember or think about nature in the public sphere. But this is why nature is so critical. And obviously it's intimately tied as a dual crisis with climate. Next slide. And then I'm going to breeze through this quickly and just say that this is published concept and data in Nature, really showing the gray line that this is business as usual and bending the curve. We hear about bending the curve on GHG. We got to bend the curve on biodiversity. I cannot say enough why biodiversity is so important for our viability. Think of agriculture and pollinators just as some of it, but so many other things, medical discoveries, ecosystem function requires healthy species that are interconnected. So the gray line is if we have business as usual, the trajectory. The yellow line is if we just think of really viably implementing conservation objectives, protected areas. There's a big initiative around 30 by 30, trying to put aside 30% of the world's seascapes and landscapes in some sort of protected area. But we need to do more than that. That will not be enough to bend the curve. And so this green line and everything else is needed is a working lands approach, and why we have to also, from production side, from our consumption side, think of other additional sustainability efforts to bend this curve for nature. Next slide. So why livestock? And let me now get into the meat of the presentation. Sorry for the pun. But why livestock? I don't need to tell this group, but obviously it is not just for food security. Obviously it is. It is nutrition. It is livelihoods. It is culture. And so in WWF, we are not an organization to wag our finger and say, no animal ag. We think animals should not be part of the food system. Absolutely. And there's evidence, in the fossil record that animals have been an intimate part of our ag systems for millennia. So it's not that we can't do agriculture, and we understand, and there's such a key role they play, we know, in regenerative ag systems and nutrient cycling, but also we work and partner with ranchers in the Northern Great Plains here in the US, but in Colombia and Brazil, around the world really, because they are huge stewards of grassland ecosystems. And that is a really important thing to remember, that we know that these systems are important and that they support livestock. And so the other on the right, you probably all noticed too, that global meat consumption is increasing by orders of magnitude. And then there's more data to break that up by commodity. And we know poultry especially, it's about a flat line almost for beef, some increases for dairy, but basically it's increasing with every region, but definitely in emerging markets and obviously in Asia. Next slide. So we have to deal with this increase, but we also know that we need to reduce emissions from ag. And we think of transport and energy, but we also know ag is a huge contributor to GHG. And that just by ag alone, the targets we need to do to reduce global emissions to get to the 2-degree scenario, or even the 1.5 degree scenario, just business as usual for the way our food production would go, literally food emissions, sorry again for the pun, they would eat up the total GHG budget to have us on track to achieve our climate targets. And so that is shocking and alarming. And so we cannot achieve these goals unless we address agriculture. Next slide. And so livestock, not a surprise, is the majority of our food footprint. And it's 25 to 33%, depending on if you look at only production or you also look at post-harvest processing and transport, et cetera. So that's where a lot of the discrepancies are. But it is undeniably livestock, both in the direct production. You guys know this better than me, the specific numbers on enteric, on manure, but also feed. But the thing I want to point out here, so it's obviously animal feed or feed for animals versus crops produced for human consumption. And obviously crops for biofuels too is a huge component right now. But the piece at the bottom, the brown, I really want to call out because that is one of the takeaways here, why it's important to think more broadly. And some of the, I'm going to link back to what Marty was talking about with the LCAs and the assumptions and limitations and the nuances that you need to think about, because not all corn or soy is created equal. The assumptions that go into these models that give you your answer might be based in flawed assumptions, and where are there data gaps. So land use change is a huge component, or a very significant component, of the food footprint. And it is a very big component of, it's a very significant component of the feed footprint as well. And so that is something to take into account, and sourcing and thinking about what regenerative feed systems looks like isn't just about the production on the field. It's even the sourcing of the land and whether that land was converted or not, where it came from. Next slide. We also, I'm honing in on feed. I know feed affects a lot about animal nutrition and enteric, but I'm really going to focus just on the feed itself in this. And like I mentioned in this talk, and our team, we did a series, a feed summit partnering with iFeeder, which is the research arm of the American Feed Association last year, and had almost 24 companies provide innovations in safe space for a pre-competitive just learning platform exchange. There were a lot of cool ideas and innovations coming out of there. And then we just last month, maybe February, March, it was early March, published a white paper based on that. Our team did a series of webinars around feed sustainability as well, and then really highlighted some of the companies from the Feed Summit, but also just doing a lit review and sort of a 101, right? What is the contribution of feed to livestock footprint? So it's anywhere from 20 to 60%, depending on the commodity. Obviously, beef and dairy are doing a lot of grazing, and there's a lot of inputs coming from there. And so it's 60% in the poultry and broiler sector. And you can see the different pink shading is the contribution from land use change, is what LUC means. So it's the feed production and inputs of the feed itself, but it's also the embedded emissions from converting land to produce that feed. Next slide. And so we need to be thinking about feed's impact on the environment beyond, again, just climate and beyond just carbon. I appreciated someone else, Marty, said nitrogen is almost the bigger issue on thinking of mitigation of emissions. I would also say land use change from embedded emissions are significant. And then there's really not, I think the other one people have brought up, water, and then just the habitat loss is what is driving the nature loss, right? It's just, if you mow down someone's backyard, that is, you're losing habitat. So that's a nature impact, let alone the water and ecosystem. So all of these things, contribute to impacts. And again, we just need to be broader in thinking about valuing what we are trying to minimize, as well as the interventions and what impact they have. Next slide. I'm going to blow through this. There's also, we have talked a lot about our footprint on climate, but we are talking less about climate's impact on the ability to produce feed. And there's a lot of risks to feed systems, which then affects feed quality, feed availability, et cetera. So I'm not going to go through all of this. And so some of the interventions we are talking about can actually help mitigate or create resilient feed systems to address climate adaptation, not just our mitigation footprint. Next slide. So the opportunity and the way we are framing it into the different buckets, there's some things that will look very familiar, but again, I'm guessing the land use change or conversion embedded footprint might be something that this group may or may not think about. And again, soy coming from Brazil and converted Cerrado lands versus soy coming from, established fields, for instance, maybe in Iowa, would have potentially orders of magnitude footprint if you include land use change. So that halting conversion and actually understanding and knowing the soy source is critical. And so models that don't take into account and use just one number for soy are flawed, because like I said, there's almost more variability within the source and the kind of soy than there could be from soy versus some other feed input. And then carbon sequestration is another one, right? There's a lot of excitement about that, what practices you can do to drive carbon into soils. There's, frankly, in our mind, a little bit less of excitement than there should be. It's not that there is no potential, and absolutely we should optimize co-benefits, but we shouldn't be thinking that we're going to pay farmers to farm carbon when really they're trying to farm beef or soy or whatever. And so we need, this is not the model that you're going to drive economics to get adoption for farmers. But we should be thinking about the emissions reduction. That's something we think and talk less about. Pollution emissions as well as GHG emissions. And then what are the incentives? I like to think of a system that has carrots and sticks. So what are those that help drive the adoption, and how can we also think about this emissions reduction and not only focus so much on the sequestration things? These are all things you guys know well, right? Like enteric manure management, et cetera. Next slide. And we also are bucketing, this is all in our white paper, the solution sets into sort of 4 different buckets. And obviously enabling environment and policy and regulatory environment that Ermias mentioned, we totally are all about that too and agree. And we would embed that within each of these. So again, responsible sourcing, understanding where the feed footprint comes from. Regenerative ag is what you think it is on the field level, production practices that minimize inputs, minimize cover cropping, all of that. And then circular ingredients, there's a lot of innovations about taking waste products, whether it's invasive species, whether it is waste products. We are working and know of partners working on retail, grocery store chains who are companies, private sector companies that are harvesting that waste, turning it into feed pellets, displacing conventional feed ingredients, and then feeding it to animals, and then actually registering a carbon footprint and environmental footprint reduction. So there's all different ways of driving circularity. I'd say the Dutch are also doing quite a lot of interesting things on that. And then feed innovations. And this, I think we are going to be launching a feed innovation platform to really break this down for producers. We've heard of enzymes, you've heard of precision feeding. I know there's things on like methane vaccines. There's all sorts of ways, and it's hard to think about what and how and why I should adopt this. How do I look at the trade-offs? How do I look at the cost effectiveness? How do I evaluate it? So companies are also trying to look at what is their role in motivating this for producers. How do they unpack all this? So there's a big bucket. And then what is the right enabling environment to try to support, to unlock these things? What are the barriers to adoption? So all of the things that were mentioned in the previous panel are things that in a pre-competitive way, we really need to break down and walk through what are these innovations, what are the barriers to adoption, which ones are most promising, and what's the data to support them? What other proof of concept do we need? Next slide. This is the same thing, just in some examples. I'm going to just breeze through this because I'm very conscious of time. We're way over. Next slide. This, I'm not going to go into detail other than to say that Marty's example, this was a really interesting, recently published paper looking at feed trials of footprint using different feed formulations. There's the first one, CSBM, is conventional soy, corn and soy. The second one includes some percentage of DDGs. The third one is some percentage of food loss and waste integrated in. The other one is synthetic amino acids added to the mix. The fourth one included phytase. So my point is that there's all kinds of innovations you can think about, whether, and we've heard about some of them, but that you have to do an analysis to see what's the resulting impact. And in this particular case, they were trying to show that food loss and waste integrated can actually reduce the footprint, GHG and land use, and then down below the total solids and also water use. Some, water use a little bit, but there's trade-offs of other people have noted. So I'm not going to go in, is this the right definitive piece of research? You can probably find 10 other studies, but my point is that there's variations, and we have a lot of modeling exercises out there. There is not as much trying to capture how do you think how do you start to bucket these innovations and drive really the potential of maybe we should be driving synthetic amino acids at certain stages of development of a animal's life cycle. What would that do? And then how would we get that to scale? So we need to think about this more systematically, and then we need evidence and data, not just modeling. Next. And then I'll mention another innovative ingredient. It's not the end all be all. It's in a list of many others, but seaweed is one. And I know people think about it for enteric methane potential, and there's some, controversy over is that true or not. But actually, we are helping to fund with Bezos money, and we have impact investing money. We've made impact investments in the largest seaweed production facility in Europe. Actually, they now have a facility. They're starting off the coast of California. So they're the only seaweed company working in 2 continents and 2 countries. But they are also funding trials for pigs and swine, so monogastrics, in Denmark, and they're seeing great, and they're really innovating on the delivery. People are talking, it's a surried sludge fermented, and the idea is that they're showing growth promotion because there's lots of micronutrients, as well as it displaces some other feed ingredients traditionally. And the idea that it takes nothing to grow it in the ocean, I can tell you, it's really quite fast growing with no inputs. It's amazing. Okay, so let me keep going. I'm going to finish up. Yeah, let's go. You can get through that. Let's just conclude. Let me go to the last slide, and let me just conclude. And I think the thing I wanted just to say to leave you with again is the idea that we really believe, as others have said, that our role and what we're trying to do, hopefully with folks like you, that's why I'm here, is to elevate the importance of feed sustainability defined broadly beyond just GHG as a really key important lever for sustainability across all animal ag commodities, building that culture change and motivation to understand how to unlock that across the supply chain, but starting with producers for sure. And then we do need footprint tools and frameworks and tools for capacity. So trying to add ESG into your animal nutrition calculators, it obviously is about animal health and productivity and production and cost. But adding ESG is also important. Is it soy from here or soy from there? How would you make these decisions? So we are piloting that with aquaculture feed, for instance. Would love to translate that to terrestrial feed. And we also need to unlock the regulatory and enabling environment. We need to really unpack and really help socialize innovations and drive them and get proof of concepts. And then we really need to get incentives right and make sure the economics work for the bottom line for the producer. And there's a lot of different things we have for that as well. So that is the kind of stuff we work on. And we would love to partner with those much more technical and in-depth on what you do to drive animal nutrition and sustainability. So thank you so much.